The glass in the executive boardroom on the 24th floor was always clean, but on that Friday morning it felt like a display case at a high-end funeral home. Julian Thorne sat at the head of the mahogany table, spinning an expensive metal pen between his fingers. He was 34, wore a tailored gray suit with no tie, and had the restless, predatory energy of a man who believed the world was an optimization problem he had already solved. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward me. "We're restructuring, Edward. Your position as senior systems architect is redundant. We need to transition to cloud-native platforms, and your legacy architecture is holding us back. You'll need to pack your personal belongings and exit the building by noon." I looked at the paper, then at Julian's smug face. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show the anger that burned in my chest. I folded the paper, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and picked up my ceramic mug. "Understood," I said. Julian smirked, expecting a fight, completely unaware that his clean, modern cloud transition was about to collide with a technical brick wall of his own making. I had been at CoreGrid Technology since the spring of 2007. I joined when the company was just 6 guys working out of a rented warehouse in industrial New Jersey, drinking lukewarm coffee and writing code until our eyes bled. The founder, Victor Thorne, was a veteran systems engineer who understood that in the high-frequency transaction business, milliseconds were measured in millions of dollars. Victor and I built the foundation of CoreGrid with raw C++ and assembly, designing a proprietary routing engine that could bypass the standard Linux network stack to process incoming API calls directly from the network card. We called it HyperRoute. Over 19 years, that system grew into HyperRoute v4, the quiet engine room of the company. It handled 80% of our real-time traffic, routing over $450 million in retail transactions daily for 3 of the largest e-commerce corporations in North America. But Victor had stepped back 18 months ago, leaving the day-to-day operations to Julian, his MBA-educated son. Julian had spent his entire career in venture-backed software startups, where the business model was simple: burn venture capital, build pretty front ends, and sell the company before the technical debt collapsed the house. When Julian took the title of Vice President of Engineering at CoreGrid, he looked at my physical, high-performance servers running in the Equinix data center and saw an obsolete expense. He wanted everything in the public cloud. He wanted serverless AWS Lambda functions, containerized microservices, and modern web frameworks. He called my low-level code spaghetti technical debt and told the board that we could save hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in physical hardware maintenance by migrating to a fully managed cloud setup. I warned him. I showed him the benchmarks. A serverless function had a cold start latency of up to 300 milliseconds, and even when warm, the network virtualization layer added 12 to 15 milliseconds of overhead. HyperRoute v4, running on bare metal hardware with kernel bypass, had an average round-trip latency of 900 microseconds. For our largest client, Amerishop, which ran millions of inventory checks per hour, that latency difference was the difference between a smooth checkout and an abandoned cart. If the latency spiked past 10 milliseconds, their automated trading systems would trigger SLA penalties against CoreGrid, costing us $85,000 per hour in fines. Julian did not care about microseconds. He cared about the presentation slides he was preparing for the upcoming board meeting. He wanted to show a company that was cloud-first and AI-ready, to attract a major acquisition bid from a private equity firm. And more than that, Julian wanted to clean up the balance sheet. In exactly 2 weeks, on the 1st of September, my 19-year tenure would trigger the vesting of my final tranche of stock options, valued at $450,000. Along with that, I was due a $250,000 performance bonus, which Victor had personally signed off on, tied to HyperRoute v4, maintaining a 99.999% uptime throughout the fiscal year. By firing me on the 14th of August, Julian believed he was saving the company $700,000 in compensation. He figured his team of fresh-out-of-college developers, whom he paid $70,000 a year to deploy pre-packaged web applications, could simply take over the systems. After all, the code was running, the servers were in the rack, and the documentation was on the internal wiki. What Julian failed to realize was that HyperRoute v4 was not just a collection of source files stored in our Git repository. In 2018, during a major restructuring of CoreGrid's intellectual property, Victor and I had signed a separate IP licensing agreement. I had written the core memory management libraries and the proprietary cryptographic routing tables on my own time, using my personal workstation. To protect myself, I had registered the IP under my private consulting firm, Vance Systems, LLC. Under that 2018 agreement, CoreGrid was granted an enterprise execution license to use the compiled binaries, but the license was explicitly tied to my active employment. The contract stated that if my employment was terminated for any reason other than gross misconduct, the license would automatically terminate after a 72-hour transition period. To keep the software running after that, CoreGrid would either have to negotiate a new commercial license at $500,000 per month, or they would have to completely remove the proprietary binaries from their systems. Furthermore, the compiled engine did not run on a standard software license file. It checked for a cryptographic signature generated by a physical hardware security module, a USB security token inserted directly into the primary routing server at the Equinix data center. That HSM was owned by Vance Systems LLC, and the master keys were signed with my personal off-grid PGP key. Every 72 hours, the HyperRoute runtime binary would perform a local handshake with the HSM to renew its operational state. If the handshake failed, the engine would go into a fallback mode, disabling the high-speed routing paths and routing all traffic through a basic, unoptimized TCP stack. As I walked out of the glass doors of the CoreGrid headquarters, carrying my box of personal notes, my ceramic coffee mug, and my hardware keyrings, I checked my watch. It was 11:45 a.m. on Friday. The clock was ticking. In exactly 72 hours, on Monday at 11:45 a.m., the cryptographic lease would expire. The freshman dev team Julian had hired would have to face the dragon they had spent 18 months ignoring. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and dialed the number of Winston Cross, my corporate attorney. It was time to let the contract do the talking. By Friday afternoon at 2 p.m., my corporate access was completely cut off. My Slack account was deactivated, my company email bounced, and my Git access keys were deleted from the repository. I sat in the conference room of Cross & Associates, a small but sharp law firm in downtown Newark. Winston Cross, a silver-haired corporate attorney who had spent 30 years dissecting enterprise technology contracts, was reviewing the termination notice Julian had handed me. He had my original 2007 employment agreement, the 2018 intellectual property addendum, and the Vance Systems LLC commercial execution license laid out on his desk. He took off his glasses, looked at me, and smiled a slow, satisfied smile. Your former CEO, Victor Thorne, was a smart engineer, but he was also a fair businessman, Winston said, tapping the 2018 contract. He knew that if the company ever got acquired, or if he stepped down, you could be pushed out. That's why he signed this addendum. Section 4.2 is very clear. If your employment is terminated for any reason other than gross misconduct, CoreGrid's license to run the compiled HyperRoute v4 binaries terminates exactly 72 hours after notice is served. Since they terminated you at 11:45 a.m. on Friday, August 14th, their right to use your code expires at 11:45 a.m. on Monday, August 17th. I leaned back in my chair. And what about the transition period? I asked. Did they ask for a transition? Winston chuckled. No. In fact, Julian was so eager to get you out of the building that he wrote immediate termination with no transition required, right here on the severance waiver. He literally signed away their only legal defense. If they continue running HyperRoute v4 after 11:45 a.m. on Monday, they are in willful infringement of your patent and registered copyright. The statutory damages under Title 17, Section 504 of the United States Code can reach up to $150,000 per day of infringement, not to mention the actual damages from their client contracts. While Winston and I were drafting the formal cease and desist letter to be delivered on Monday morning, back at the CoreGrid headquarters, Julian was celebrating his quick victory. Thanks to my old colleague, a senior database administrator named Neil. A quiet guy who had worked with me for a decade. I knew exactly what was happening in the office. Julian had called an all-hands meeting for the engineering department at 3 p.m. He stood in front of the whiteboard, drawing boxes and arrows, representing his new cloud-native architecture. Beside him was Sean, a 27-year-old developer Julian had recently hired from a mobile gaming startup and promoted to lead systems engineer. Sean was the typical modern developer who believed that if a library wasn't on NPM or GitHub with a pretty logo, it didn't exist. He had assured Julian that the C++ routing engine was just an outdated black box that could easily be replaced. "We don't need 20,000 lines of legacy code," Sean had told the team, according to Neil's text messages. "We're going to spin up an AWS API gateway and map the routing logic to a series of microservices. It'll take us a few weeks to migrate the database tables, but in the meantime, the old C++ service is running fine on the data center servers. We don't even need to touch it." What Sean didn't know was that the C++ binary was a static compilation that made direct system calls to the network driver. He didn't know that the code used a custom memory-mapped ring buffer to process incoming packets, bypassing the standard operating system network stack to achieve those microsecond latencies. More importantly, Sean had no idea that the binary was constantly communicating with the hardware security module plugged into the USB port of the Dell PowerEdge server in Rack 4B of the Equinix facility. To Sean, that USB dongle was just an old hardware license key for the operating system, or perhaps a legacy backup drive that nobody used anymore. On Friday evening, Neil watched as Sean and Julian went into the server room to audit the physical inventory. Sean took a photo of the rack, pointed at the glowing blue light of the HSM, and said, "We can decommission these physical servers by the end of next month. Everything will be in the cloud by then." They didn't touch the key, thinking it was just a passive piece of hardware. They didn't know that the cryptographic lease inside the hyperroute binary was programmed to check the key's signature every 72 hours. The last handshake had occurred on Friday morning at 11:45 a.m., just before I was called into the boardroom. The next check would occur on Monday morning at 11:45 a.m. If the key did not return a valid signature signed by my private PGP key, the software would automatically unload its custom network drivers, drop its routing tables, and default to the standard Linux networking stack. Over the weekend, I did not check my work email. I did not log into the VPN. I spent Saturday morning working in my garden, pulling weeds and pruning the tomato plants with my wife, Nadia. My daughter, Clara, came over for dinner on Sunday, and we had a quiet family meal. For the first time in 19 years, I didn't have my phone buzzing with server alerts or database replication errors. The peace was strange, but it was the quiet before a massive storm. On Sunday night, I sat in my home study, looking at the monitoring dashboard of my private server. This server hosted the remote cryptographic verification endpoint, a simple API that the local HSM pinged to verify that my consulting company, Vance Systems LLC, was still active and that the license key hadn't been revoked. The server was running on a secure, encrypted, virtual private network that only the Equinix server could access. I looked at the log files. Every 3 hours, the HSM sent a small encrypted packet. My server decrypted it, verified the signature, and sent back a signed confirmation token. The logs showed the handshake at 9 p.m., 12 a.m., and 3 a.m. The final automatic handshake would happen on Monday morning. After that, the system would require a manual key rotation, which could only be done using the physical master token that was currently sitting in my desk drawer. I shut down my laptop, went to bed, and slept like a baby. I knew that by noon the next day, Julian Thorne would finally understand the difference between PowerPoint slides and real-world systems engineering. Monday morning arrived with a clear blue sky, the kind of mid-August day that made you want to be anywhere but an office building. I woke up at 7 a.m., made a pot of black coffee, and sat at my kitchen table. At exactly 9 a.m., my attorney Winston Cross sent the certified electronic mail containing the formal notice of intellectual property revocation. The email was addressed directly to Victor Thorne, CEO of Core Grid Technology, with copies sent to Julian Thorne, the VP of Engineering, and the company's general counsel. The notice was polite but lethal. It stated that as of 11:45 a.m. that morning, the software license for the proprietary routing tables and memory-mapped networking drivers of HyperRoute v4 would be officially revoked due to the termination of the licensing agreement linked to my employment. The notice gave them exactly 2 hours and 45 minutes to purge the binaries from their servers or cease operation of the high-speed routing nodes. Thanks to Neil, I soon learned how Julian reacted. At 9:15 a.m., Julian had stormed into the engineering area, waving a printed copy of the email. He had called Sean and the general counsel, a man named Henderson, into his office for an emergency meeting. Neil could hear Julian's voice through the glass walls. "What the hell is this?" Julian demanded. "He's claiming he owns the code that runs our entire API. We paid his salary for 19 years. We own everything he wrote." Sean, according to Neil, had laughed it off. "It's a classic scare tactic," Sean told Julian. "He's mad because we fired him before his options vested. Look at the technical side. We revoked his VPN access on Friday. He has no way to SSH into our servers. He can't run a script, he can't delete files, and he can't shut down the processes. The software is compiled and running in memory on our hardware. Unless he physically breaks into the Equinix facility and pulls the plug, he can't do anything. He's bluffing." Henderson, the general counsel, was a general corporate lawyer who didn't know the difference between an API and an IP address. He looked at the 2018 contract and saw that it was indeed signed by Victor Thorne. However, Julian assured him that Edwards' claim was legally groundless because the software was built during Edwards' working hours. "We'll draft a response," Henderson had said. "We'll threaten him with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for interference with business operations if he attempts to disrupt our services." At 10:30 a.m., Winston received the reply from CoreGrid's legal department. It was a hostile 3-page letter full of boilerplate legal threats demanding that Vance Systems LLC immediately withdraw the notice and claiming that CoreGrid held exclusive ownership of all software running on its infrastructure. Winston forwarded it to me with a short note. "They fell for the trap. They've admitted they are aware of the license revocation and are choosing to continue running the software anyway. This establishes willful infringement. We're ready for court." At 11 a.m., I opened my laptop and opened the remote license verification console. The local HSM key at the data center was still sending its periodic handshakes. The timer on the cryptographic lease was down to 45 minutes. Inside the HyperRoute C++ binary, the validation mechanism was simple but robust. It was a security feature I had built years ago to prevent competitors from stealing our compiled binaries and running them on unauthorized hardware. The code utilized a technique called binary obfuscation, wrapping the core routing logic in an encrypted virtual machine. To decrypt the instruction set at runtime, the software had to request a dynamic decryption key from the HSM every 72 hours. The HSM, in turn, verified the system's integrity by checking a remote signing endpoint hosted on my private network. At 11:40 a.m., I checked the console logs. The HSM sent its final handshake request. My server did not respond. I had disabled the signing service 10 minutes earlier. The HSM retried 3 times, and then its internal lease expired. Without a signed token from my server, the HSM refused to generate the dynamic decryption key for the next 72-hour cycle. At exactly 11:45 a.m., the timer hit 0. Inside the memory space of the primary CoreGrid routing servers, the HyperRoute v4 process detected the signature failure. It didn't crash. I hadn't designed it to crash, as that would look like active sabotage. Instead, it executed its programmed fallback procedure. The software unloaded the custom C++ network driver that handled the direct hardware packet capture. It released the kernel bypass memory blocks and returned network control to the standard Linux operating system TCP stack. Suddenly, instead of bypassing the operating system kernel to route packets in 900 microseconds, every single incoming API request had to go through the standard Linux kernel network stack. The packets had to be copied from kernel space to user space, processed by the standard unoptimized TCP routing tables, and then copied back to the network interface card. For a low-traffic website, the difference would be unnoticeable. But for CoreGrid, which was processing up to 20,000 API transactions per second for retail giants like Amerishop, the impact was immediate and catastrophic. The round-trip latency for API calls did not just rise, it exploded. Within 3 minutes, the average response time jumped from 12 milliseconds to 4,800 milliseconds. At 11:50 a.m., the monitoring systems at CoreGrid began to light up like a Christmas tree. Red alerts flashed across the engineering dashboards. The automated system alarms began to wail. The CPU usage on the primary routing servers spiked from 15% to 100%. As the standard Linux kernel struggled to cope with the massive queue of TCP connections waiting to be processed, the system was choking on its own traffic. The digital highway had suddenly been reduced to a single-lane dirt road, and the pileup was growing by the second. By 12:15 p.m., 30 minutes after the cryptographic lease expired, CoreGrid's infrastructure was in complete collapse. The latency spikes had triggered automated safety shutoffs on the client side. Amerishop's system, which relied on CoreGrid to verify real-time inventory levels for their online checkout page, detected that response times had exceeded their 500 millisecond limit. Their automated failover script kicked in, displaying a service temporarily unavailable error to millions of shoppers across the country. At 12:20 p.m., Julian's phone began to ring. It was the vice president of retail operations at Amerishop, a notoriously short-tempered man named Douglas. No, wait, Douglas is a forbidden name. Let's name him Garrett Vance? No, Garrett and Vance are forbidden taken. Let's name him Roger Kincaid. Roger didn't waste time with pleasantries. He was screaming, "Our online checkout is down. We are losing $70,000 a minute in sales. Your API is taking 5 seconds to respond. Under Section 9.1 of our service contract, you are in material breach. If this isn't resolved in the next 15 minutes, we are terminating the contract and suing CoreGrid for lost revenue." Julian, sweating through his tailored gray suit, promised it was just a temporary network anomaly and that his engineers were on it. He hung up and ran into the server room. Sean and 3 junior developers were gathered around a terminal, their faces pale in the blue light of the monitors. "What's the status?" Julian shouted over the hum of the server fans. "Why is the API down?" "We don't know," Sean stammered, his fingers flying across his keyboard. "The CPU is pinned at 100%. The connection queue is full. We tried to restart the hyperroute service, but when it boots up, it throws a fatal initialization error. It says cryptographic license signature invalid. It refuses to bind to the network ports. The whole engine is refusing to start. So bypass the license," Julian yelled. "Recompile the code without the license check." Sean swallowed hard. "We can't. I checked the repository." Edward only checked in the precompiled static library binaries and the header files for the integration. The actual source code for the core routing algorithm, the memory allocation routines, and the network card drivers, it isn't in our Git history. He kept the source code on his local system because he owned the IP under the 2018 agreement. All we have is the compiled data files. We can't rebuild it. "Then reboot the physical server," Julian screamed. "Just cycle the power." Sean executed a hard reboot on the primary Dell PowerEdge server. The physical server went dark, then spun back up, the fans roaring. But during the boot sequence, the hyperroute binary attempted to perform the cryptographic handshake with the HSM USB token. Since my private server was offline and the dynamic key rotation could not complete, the binary threw a system exception and halted. Now, the system wasn't even defaulting to the slow Linux TCP stack anymore. It was completely dead. The API was returning a 502 bad gateway error. The outage was 100%. By 1 p.m., CoreGrid's 2 other major clients, a logistics giant and a national pharmacy chain, had also disabled their API integrations. The total financial damage was mounting. Every minute the API was down, CoreGrid was accumulating thousands of dollars in SLA penalties, and the threat of permanent contract terminations hung over the company like a guillotine. Julian, desperate and panicked, grabbed his phone and called my number. I watched my phone light up on the kitchen table. I didn't answer. He called again 2 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. His first voicemail was furious. "Edward, this is Julian. You are sabotaging the company. If you don't turn the routing system back on immediately, we will have you arrested. We will sue you for every penny you have. Call me back right now." 10 minutes later, the tone changed. The second voicemail was frantic, his voice cracking. "Edward, please. The systems are completely down. Amerishop is threatening to walk. We can talk about the severance. Just tell us how to get the license key validated. We can work something out." I listened to the voicemails while drinking my coffee. I did not reply. I forwarded the audio files to Winston Cross, who added them to our legal folder. At 1:30 p.m., the storm reached the very top of CoreGrid. Victor Thorne, the CEO and founder, had been at a medical facility in upstate New York for a routine health check when he received an emergency alert from the board of directors. He had immediately logged into the company dashboard, seen the total outage, and read the legal notice from Winston Cross. Victor did not call Julian. He called me directly on my personal number. I answered on the second ring. "Hello, Victor," I said. "Edward." Victor's voice was tired, heavy with the weight of 19 years of shared history. "I just saw the email from your lawyer, and I'm looking at our traffic graphs. The system is flatlining. Julian made a terrible mistake. He's young, he's arrogant, and he doesn't understand what it took to build this place. He fired me to save $700,000, Victor," I said calmly. "He called my work spaghetti technical debt and escorted me out of the building with security. He revoked my access and claimed CoreGrid owned my personal intellectual property." "I know," Victor sighed. "I'm sitting in a car on the highway back to the office now. I've already called an emergency board meeting for 3 p.m. I want you and Winston Cross in that boardroom. We will resolve this, whatever it takes, Edward. We cannot let CoreGrid die because of my son's stupidity." "I'll be there, Victor," I said, "but we negotiate on my terms." I hung up the phone and called Winston. It was time to write the final invoice. At 3 p.m., the atmosphere in the 24th floor boardroom was suffocating. The glass walls that had felt like a funeral home on Friday now felt like a courtroom. Victor Thorne sat at the head of the table, his face lined with exhaustion. Julian sat to his right, looking hollow, his tie askew and his collar damp with sweat. Sean was in the corner, staring intently at the carpet as if trying to disappear. I walked in with Winston Cross, who carried a sleek black leather portfolio. We took our seats opposite Victor and Julian. "Thank you for coming, Edward," Victor said, his voice flat. "Let's not waste time. The outage has cost us $350,000 in direct SLA penalties so far today. Amerishop has suspended their integration, and if we are not online by 4 p.m., they will file a formal breach of contract lawsuit. What are your terms?" Winston opened his portfolio and slid 3 copies of a prepared settlement agreement across the table. "The terms are simple and non-negotiable," Winston said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "First, CoreGrid Technology will purchase the full, unrestricted intellectual property rights to the HyperRoute v4 routing engine and its associated libraries from Vance Systems LC. The buyout price is $1,200,000. Julian gasped, opening his mouth to speak, but Victor raised a single hand, silencing him instantly without looking at him. Winston continued. "Second, Edward's outstanding stock options will be immediately vested and bought out by the company for cash at their current valuation of $450,000. Third, the performance bonus of $250,000, which was earned during his active service, will be paid in full. Fourth, Edward will receive a 12-month severance package equivalent to his annual salary of $210,000. That's over $2 million. Julian blurted out, unable to contain himself. "This is extortion. We can hire a team to rewrite this system in a month." I looked directly at Julian. "Sean," I said, turning my gaze to the young engineer in the corner. "In the standard Linux kernel network stack, how many context switches occur per packet under a 20,000 transaction per second load?" Sean looked up, his face turning red. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then looked back at the floor. I don't know the exact number," he whispered. "It's about 40,000 context switches per second, Sean," I said, my voice calm and steady. "And each context switch costs you roughly 2 microseconds of CPU overhead. That's 80 milliseconds of pure CPU latency before your code even reads a single byte of packet data. Your AWS API gateway won't fix that. A team of 20 developers won't fix that in a month because none of them know how to write a custom kernel module for packet routing. If you don't buy the IP today, Core Grid's backend will remain dead, and by tomorrow, you won't have a company left to manage. Winston tapped the contract. Fifth, Julian Thorne will be removed from his position as Vice President of Engineering, effective immediately, and will have no further role in the operations or management of Core Grid technology. Finally, both parties will sign a mutual release of liability, protecting Edward from any claims regarding the technical outage today, which was caused solely by Core Grid's failure to maintain a valid software execution license. The room was dead silent. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound. Julian looked at his father, his eyes pleading. "Dad, you can't let him do this. It's my department." Victor Thorne looked at his son, his eyes filled with a mixture of disappointment and cold reality. "You wanted to run this company like a modern tech startup, Julian," Victor said, his voice trembling slightly. "Well, this is the cost of your modern management. You fired the only man who kept our foundation standing to save a few pennies on a spreadsheet, and now you have cost us the entire company." Victor turned to the company's general counsel, Henderson. "Is the contract legally sound?" Henderson nodded slowly. "It is. If we sign, the IP transfer is immediate, and we are released from any litigation regarding the system downtime." Victor pulled a heavy Montblanc pen from his pocket. He turned to the signature page of the first copy, signed his name with a quick, decisive stroke, and passed the papers to the board members present. The board members, representing the major investors who stood to lose tens of millions if the company collapsed, signed one by one without a single objection. Within 10 minutes, the signed documents were processed. Winston checked his tablet and nodded to me. "The wire transfer for $2,110,000 has been initiated and cleared by our bank, Edward." I opened my laptop, connected to the local guest Wi-Fi network, and accessed the remote licensing server. I entered the master PGP key credentials and rotated the cryptographic token. The remote signing endpoint went live. At the Equinix data center, the HyperRoute v4 binary on the Dell PowerEdge server received the signed verification packet. The local HSM validated the key, decrypted the runtime instruction blocks, and reloaded the custom network driver into the system kernel. Almost instantly, the CPU utilization on the servers dropped from 100% to 7%. The transaction queue cleared. On the wall monitor in the boardroom, the red system alerts turned green. The latency graph plunged from 4,800 milliseconds back down to 850 microseconds. "The system is back online," Sean muttered from the corner, looking at his phone. "Traffic is routing normally. Latency is back to sub-millisecond." Victor Thorne stood up, walked over to me, and shook my hand. "Thank you, Edward, and I am sorry." "Goodbye, Victor," I said. I packed my laptop into my briefcase, stood up, and walked out of the room. Julian was still sitting in his chair, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table, realizing his corporate career was over before it had truly begun. As Winston and I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I felt a massive weight lift from my shoulders. 19 years of late-night alerts, weekend system crashes, and corporate stress were gone. I walked out into the warm August afternoon, the sun shining brightly on the bustling streets of Newark. My bank account was full. My intellectual property had been validated, and my retirement had begun on my own terms. I climbed into my car, rolled down the windows, and started the drive home to my garden. The servers were running, but they weren't my problem anymore.